Good morning, everyone. Good morning. You're very welcome to this another Outdoor Recreation Network webinar. Alan, you can maybe get me up on screen there as well, can you? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, my name's Chris Scott. I work for Outdoor Recreation Northern Ireland, and we deliver the Secretariat services for the Outdoor Recreation Network. So you're very welcome. You're very welcome here today. This is the Returning Volunteers Safely webinar. It's one of a series of webinars we've been running during the COVID-19 lockdown period. We had one back in May, which was approaches to reopening the outdoors, and you're all doing that at different paces now as your national legislation allows. We also hope to do 2 future webinars during August and September on maximising the opportunity to deliver outdoor learning, and also another one about looking ahead and what are the public telling us. There's been lots of good surveys carried out during the lockdown period. So what are the public telling us, and most importantly, how do we react? We then hope to return to our physical meetings in November, obviously keeping a watching brief on that along with everybody else, and hope to have a conference in November. But say we'll keep you up to speed on that as things become clear as we move forward. You can keep up to date on all those events. You can subscribe to our easing. The folks will put a link up to that in a wee second. You can follow us on Twitter, or you can join us on LinkedIn as well. So just simply search Outdoor Recreation Network on either of those 2 platforms, and you'll find us there. So it's great to have. I think we've over 170 people registered for this event, which is fantastic, and we're delighted with the support that you've brought to the Outdoor Recreation Network during the time. About 30% of those people are from member organisations, and about 70% are non-members. So if you're new to ORN, you're very welcome. Our chair, Fiona Groves, unfortunately isn't able to make it today. However, we'll hear from our vice chair, Pippa Langford, in a wee second. It's been great to have representatives from public, private, voluntary community, academic sector as well, which is wonderful, and organisations from all across the UK and the Republic of Ireland. So my role as MC, I'm just going to keep the thing ticking along. We've got some great presenters. If you just move on to my next slide there, Alan. We've got some great presenters for the session. We're going to hear first of all from Pippa Langford from Natural England, and also, as I said, ORN Vice Chair. She's going to give us an overview of the key issues. We've then got Helen Connor Walton, who's volunteer manager with Forestry England, to look at their process. Nick Hall is joining us again from the Woodland Trust, to talk about non-visitor facing volunteers, and then Joe Parry, the Volunteering Innovation Manager from the National Trust, is going to talk about those visitor facing volunteers. So quite a lot to cover in a short space of time. So I'm going to keep quiet now, and I'm going to pass over first of all to Pippa. Are you there, Pippa? I think you're joining us on phone.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me, Chris.
Yeah, that's great. So we're going to your first slide is up there, and we're going to pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for the great introduction. Yes, and welcome to everybody who's on the call. This should be a very useful couple of hours for those of you joining for the whole thing, and a very useful introduction to returning volunteers safely for everybody who's seeing all the presentations. I just thought it would be helpful to stand back a bit to begin with and just think, when we're in the thick of doing all these things to get volunteers back safely, just to reflect on why we're doing this. And it probably doesn't need me to tell you, but maybe it's helpful to remind ourselves just how important volunteers are to the survival of our organisations, to how we manage to deliver the outcomes that we want, whether those are helping other visitors to have a great time, whether it's about recruiting more members, whether it's about doing practical work, all sorts of things that volunteers do. The reason we want them is because they can help us become much more effective. They can extend our reach much further than we could do without them. So they're an absolutely vital part of our organisations. So once we're in the thick of it, and this is getting difficult because there will be times when it is difficult, we just need to stand back and think, these are really important people for the survival of our organisations and for getting the best outcome. And so if you could move to the next slide, or my second slide, you've probably got that one already. I can't see the slides where I am. I'd also encourage you to think of being inclusive and not to assume that we know what's right or safe for everybody. And we really need to talk to them about what they might feel comfortable doing. And sometimes that might be way beyond what we think is safe and comfortable. And other times we might be surprised by somebody who says, I just don't feel comfortable doing this. So we really need to be important and include people in those discussions, make sure that they are comfortable with what we are proposing, and be prepared to be adaptable. You know, these are new times that we have never been through before. So let's be adaptable to our volunteers, be inclusive, and not just assume that maybe because somebody's old that they don't want to come back because they're more vulnerable. Maybe they're desperate to come back, and we should do our best to accommodate them. And that leads me on to my next point about volunteers' motivations. You'll know that people are motivated by all sorts of different things. Some of them, it's a love of the place. Some of them, it's love of particular wildlife. But a lot of that motivation for being a volunteer is about doing things with other people. And that might be a bit difficult with the social distancing that people have got to do these days. So, but we should try and accommodate that ability to connect with people and work as part of a team as much as possible, because it's often kind of a real reason why people are volunteering. They're often also volunteering to be active. They want to get out of the house. Maybe they don't have any other reasons to get out of the house and do something. They want to be active. So whenever possible, we should try and accommodate that. And that might be difficult. And I'm sure we'll hear later on about the difficulties of sharing tools and all those sorts of things. But let's try and accommodate it if we can, because that's part of why volunteers volunteer. And we should also bear in mind that lots of volunteers come to us and volunteer because they actually want to give to the sector. They get a lot from giving their time, their energy, their enthusiasm. So let's try and accommodate that, try and make the most of it. And that's really important to them. And if you're familiar with the 5 steps to well-being, that's the mental health as well, you'll recognise that a lot of why people volunteer is also keeping them mentally healthy. And at the time of COVID-19, where mental health is becoming is an issue for a lot of people because they've been so isolated, getting out there and volunteering is going to give them a real boost, a real benefit. So that's lots of benefits to them. But of course, we need to be careful because we have a duty for their health and safety. And so that's part of the reason for why we're having this webinar today, is so that some leaders in this field who've been doing a lot of thinking about how to get their volunteers back can share with you their thoughts and the issues that they found when they've been preparing to get their volunteers back. So I won't keep you any longer, and I'll pass back to Chris, who's going to take us on to the next speaker. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you very much, Pippa. Thank you very much indeed. We're just going to pop back a few slides there, Alan. Great, yeah, that's us there. So just to remind you that you can engage with us through the question and answer pane. You'll see there on the top corner of your screen. If you click on that, some of you it'll pop up automatically. So feel free to ask questions during the sessions. I think everybody but Pippa can see those questions. All the rest of the presenters can, so they can answer those as you go through. If we haven't got a chance to answer them all, we'll try and pick up on those again after the webinar. Just move on to the next slide there, Alan. So there's I think there's nearly 120 people online at the moment, so obviously that's potential for a lot of people to ask questions. So just to help us moderate that, it's really useful if you can just give us a head start. So say for example you're asking a question, just drop in the presenter's name that you want to ask the question to. So it could be Nick, for example. If it's for all the panel, just say all. And then let us know the topic you want to ask the question on. So I've used the example of Nick, tea preference, and then ask your question. So one lump or two, You obviously don't want to know Nick's tea preference, but you'll make it relevant to volunteering. That just helps us make sure the right person answers the right question in the right order. It also helps you because you can actually help answer some of the questions as well. We're very conscious there's a lot of expertise amongst the attendees at this. So if somebody asks a question, tea preference, 1 lump or 2, start your answer with the same topic, tea preference. I find 1 lump is best. So hopefully that will allow us to moderate the questions and allow things flow, because otherwise it can be a bit like 120 people all shouting away in the corner of a room and the conversation not quite flowing as we want. So we'll give that a go, and hopefully that'll help things as we move along. Just the next slide there, Alan, please. Obviously then we're going to have a members breakout room after this as well. We're very conscious we've not been able to deliver our physical workshops during this period, so we want to ensure that we're providing the best value to our paid up members, which is who continue to support us, which is great. So after this, you've been sent a separate link to a members meeting, and that will allow a more interactive, like a standard Teams meeting, Q&A with the presenters, and an opportunity to share some information and documents behind the scenes. So just an added benefit there to our members in that VIP breakout room. If you haven't received that link, you should, if you're a member, you should have received it along with your login details for this webinar. But if you haven't received it, just drop Elizabeth an email there. Her email's on the screen, and she'll be able to ping that back to you, so you'll be able to join in after this. We'll give people a few moments to leave this webinar and then sign up via that as we move forward. Okay, well that's hopefully the introductions to the questions. We'll be moderating those as they go through, and I'm going to pass over first of all to Helen. Helen, are you there? Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Great, and we'll get your camera on as well, Helen. There you go. Okay, so Helen is the volunteer manager from Forestry England, and she's going to talk about how they've restarted volunteering across the nation's forests. So I'm going to disappear, and Helen should hopefully appear on your screen. And Helen, your first slide's up there. You cue Alan for the rest and continue on. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. It's great to be here with you today. Alan, can I have my next slide, please? So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of volunteering in the nation's forests so you can understand how we're having to manage the restart of our volunteer programme. We have an amazing range of volunteers supporting us, both Forestry England directed under our direct management, but also a wide range of partnership programmes from small local friends of groups through to national and regional organisations that we're working in funded projects with. And then about a third of our volunteering activity is also delivered by third-party organisations on the nation's forest, whether that be for specialist interest groups or they're interested in mountain biking and recreation and just love the local forest that they volunteer at. So over the last 12 months, we've had over 38,000 volunteer engagements on the nation's forest. And so when we halted all of that volunteering activity, it's been important for us to consider how we're going to restart that safely and effectively for all areas of our volunteer team. Next slide, Alan, please. So the key issues that we're having to consider as we look at restarting, we've been considering that over the last few weeks, months, as we went into lockdown, of how we're going to restart, was obviously considering the changing game of government guidance, but also our own situation. So staff capacity has been a large element of how we consider our restart programme for volunteering. We've had around about 40% of our staff on furlough throughout this, and therefore they weren't available to support us in the restart of our volunteering. Only this last week we've had pretty much the last members of our staff return, and that's obviously building us capacity to restart. We've also, though, had a large number of our staff being redeployed to support the wider sector of our business, whether that's from the reopening of our forest centres, but also within our wider sites with antisocial activity, etc. Volunteering for nearly all of our staff is a proportion of their role, and therefore that has also been a challenge with people working from home, challenges of home life, homeschooling, etc., and just the availability of them to be there to support our volunteers as they restart, and therefore implementing that guidance. So as we brought that together, we've been talking regularly with our volunteers and our staff so we can manage their expectations about when and how we're going to be able to restart that. As Pippa says, we've had really enthusiastic staff and volunteers wanting to restart their volunteer activity, but we've also had apprehensive staff and volunteers wondering about how they're going to manage that safely. We're considering the return of all those vulnerable volunteer groups and also our vulnerable staff members. And we're, like Pippa advised, having individual conversations with every one of those to look at whether we can implement a safe return. So that's been a big conversation for us. Again, working across multi-agencies and looking at different people's guidance so that we can work together seamlessly as much as possible for the restart. Provision of personal equipment, whether that was traditional PPE that they needed for their task through to COVID related equipment that they might need. How we're going to clean all this equipment from vehicle to tool sheds. How volunteers are going to travel to site, often sharing vehicles, jumping in vehicles with staff, and provision of appropriate welfare facilities. Next slide, please. But we've also found really great opportunities. So we've had a few challenges. Of course, all of us have been working through our government guidance to try and understand how that's going to implement. But I have to say, we've seen more opportunities by this small halt and now considering how we're going to restart. We've made some amazing relationships. So, we know we have fantastic relationships with our volunteers. They bring that energy and enthusiasm, and any of our rangers, work supervisors also have such positive experiences and want to be engaging. But we've seen that grow even more through COVID-19. Sharing stories over breaking home, the challenges of homeschooling shared between volunteers and staff, and that has just built and built and built, and it's just been lovely to see that network of community. The systems that are often groaned at by our staff have suddenly been praised. The fact that local teams didn't need to communicate directly with their volunteers as things had to be halted, and now that things are restarting, being able to use the technology there has turned their views from a slight dislike to systems to actual enjoyment and seeing benefits. We've grown knowledge of who our volunteers are. So we did have volunteering activity that we weren't fully aware of across the Nations Forest, and we've learned to understand that through this programme. There's been better relationships sometimes between local teams as well. So building that support between recreation, volunteering, land management has been really great. And we're now starting to look outwards, thinking differently about how we will engage our volunteers, talking with those volunteers about how they would like to come back, where there's opportunities for home volunteering, but also doing things differently. They might not be coming into the offices as they originally were, but they are thinking of new ways that they can do that. We're looking at online toolbox talks. Our volunteer technical advisor with her children have done some great toolbox talk via video, and these are now being emailed out so we can support our volunteers to return, along with online inductions. And as we said, social time is so important. We are now considering how we can do brew time with our volunteers. That there's nothing more important than having a cuppa, eating some cake, chatting over biscuits, and we really need to be considering how we better do that in these socially distanced times. Next slide, please. So quickly going on to the actual protocols of how we're returning. So obviously we're working on when our staff are in the capacity to restart any of the elements of volunteering, whether that's FE directed or our third party and partnership projects. And we're working on phased restart plans with each of our 7 districts to make sure that this works with their constraints, their staff resource, but based on a 3-phased approach. So we started our initial solar activity back on the 8th of June, and this was a great testing ability for us. So we were supporting those individuals to get back up and running. And then from the 22nd of this month, we started to increase that activity across other solo or small group activities where social distancing can be maintained. But what we're not doing at the minute is introducing any new volunteers to our systems. So our priority is restarting all of our 38,000 volunteers that have been engaged with us last year to make sure that they can come back and enjoy the nation's forest. And as things start to ease a little bit more, guidance changes, then we'll look forward to bringing back those more front of house volunteers when it's safe to do so. Next slide, please. So just giving you a quick overview of the protocols that we've needed to consider. So we're making sure that we have contingency plans in place for each of our locations, and that's part of our phased restart plan to ensure that if we go into local lockdown, we're able to step in really quickly and support that local team to halt any volunteering we might need to do. We're working closely with our supervisors to risk assess everything that they're doing and making sure that social distancing, provision of PPE, so we've made the clear decision that everybody will get their own hard hats, gloves, eye protection, because we don't believe we can clean that effectively, but that any of our tools are being disinfected after use and not shared during the sessions and then can be reissued to somebody else later down the line. All our volunteers are going to be on our CRM system to make sure that we can make appropriate communication with them and that they have the appropriate agreements in place. So we're using this as a great opportunity to do some housekeeping. And onto my final slide, Alan, please. We are increasing the amount of loan working that's happening. So all of our Forestry England directed volunteers will be registered on our staff loan working system. And we're completing, as I said, this vulnerable group risk assessment for all of our volunteers as we restart them. So we're actually choosing to try and do that with every volunteer. So we have a great conversation with them about how they want to restart and using that risk assessment to support that and identify any specific control measures for their role and also for their personal situation. We've increased the record keeping, so all of our volunteers that are coming in, we know exactly what day they've been in and doing their activities to support test and trace, and we'll keep reviewing that as we get further details on what the government needs us to hold on those areas. And then with our third party volunteers, we're making sure that all our permissions are updated and that we have all of the relevant paperwork from risk assessments, insurance and emergency plans from them that have been reviewed relating to COVID-19, and that they have also been uploaded onto our CRM system, because that was an area we found was lacking. It was often in paper format, and that they have appropriate welfare facilities in place relating to visa guidance. So that's everything from me.
That's great, Helen. Thank you very much. Great to see. I mean, just so much activity being undertaken in the last couple of weeks to get your systems back up and running and renew your systems, just to look at what volunteers did already to manage your estate. But it's also really interesting just to see the new opportunities and new learning that have come out of. There's been new opportunities and new learning everywhere within this period, but it's really interesting to see it in the perspective of volunteers, and interesting to see the way CRM and other technologies are coming on board to help you manage things as well. Who would have thought it even a few months ago? So really good stuff. So thanks a million for that, Helen. There's been a few questions coming in on the panel there. I'm sure you'll be keen to answer. So thanks a million. Folks, as well, I should have said at the start, this webinar is obviously being recorded as well, so this will be put up on our YouTube channel hopefully later on today, or if not tomorrow. For example, we ran our last ORN webinar. I think we had 70 or 80 people on board, but it's been watched over 600 times on YouTube since, so that'll be there for forevermore. And we'll also be sending you out a copy of the slides afterwards as well. I think there's been one comment that's come in about the quality of the slides on your screen are being a bit blurred. Unfortunately, that is a local issue with your own broadband, unfortunately, but the good news is you'll get a copy of them afterwards, which you can hopefully catch up. Okay, I'm going to pass on now to Nick Hall from the Woodland Trust, HSE manager from the Woodland Trust. You're there, okay, Nick?
I am, Chris. Thank you.
Great. Well, your intro slide's up there. You can hopefully see it okay. You're going to talk to us about the protocols of returning non-visitor facing volunteers. So I'm going to pass over to you now, Nick, and you can fire away.
Thank you, Chris, and morning, everybody. I love the comment from Helen about the importance of brew time. I think having worked with conservation volunteers for a long time, I think tea and biscuits keep them going. I just want to take you through our sort of COVID-19 pandemic volunteer journey, really, and explain what we've been doing, give you an idea how we've gone about managing the return of our sort of woodland volunteers. So first slide, please, Alan. Okay, so we've got about 3,800 volunteers across the UK, and we actually have 40 different volunteer roles, and they're incredibly diverse, really. You've got specialists that look at tree diseases, you've got individuals that go out looking for veteran trees and plotting them, and all different sorts of things. Wardens that go around looking after our estate, and woodland working groups. We've got about 100 what you would call traditional sort of conservation volunteers that go out and do the coppicing and the dry stone walling and all the practical work. Most of our volunteers are older, so we have to recognise, as people have said previously, that they are potentially more at risk from COVID. And in terms of management, we have regional staff, most of whom have been on furlough throughout the pandemic, and we have a fantastic national volunteer team who've actually been picking up the work of bringing our volunteers back in. I've been working very closely with them. Next slide, please, on. In terms of our estate and what our volunteers would normally be working on, we've got about 1,300 sites, and they've pretty much remained open throughout the whole of lockdown. Even though some of the car parks have been shut, the woods have been open. So we've had huge foot traffic, more people than usual walking through our woods and using the infrastructure like the stiles and the gates and the boardwalks. Unfortunately, we've had lots of antisocial behaviour. We've had fly tipping, we've had littering, we've had illegal raves, we've had quad bike races, we've had JCBs driven into the woods to build mountain bike tracks, and we even had a fly tipped live hand grenade, which was a bit unusual. So our woods have taken a fair amount of pressure during the pandemic, and on the back of that, because obviously our contractors have all been in lockdown and furloughed, etc., and our staff haven't been travelling, only absolutely essential safety work has been conducted. So the general maintenance work of our woods basically hasn't been happening for 3 months. So potentially, as lockdown starts to ease in England and then Northern Ireland, as it eases in Scotland and Wales, there could be some risks to our visitors. You know, infrastructure will have crumbled. There could be, fly tip rubbish, all kinds of stuff. So we have to sort of bear that in mind. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of bringing our volunteers back, volunteer wardens in England and Northern Ireland were the first to be reactivated and help get the estate back on their feet. And the reason we made that decision was basically, as I said, a lot of our sites hadn't been visited in 3 months. A typical site manager in the Woodland Trust will look after up to 60 sites, so there's no way they can possibly get around all of them, even in the same week, much less the same sort of few days. So we brought volunteer wardens back first with a sort of a task to go out and basically have a look at what had been happening on our estate, identify problems, figure out if things need fixing, report back, that sort of stuff. We've now sort of repeated that in Wales and Scotland as the 5 mile rule has been lifted. So wardens are the first ones back. Next up, please. I think in terms of sort of general approach, one of the things I discussed with our national volunteering team, we're very clear on, we can't just have welcome back everybody, our woods are open, come back, start volunteering, business as usual as it was before. There's no way we can do that. So we basically looked at it one step at a time, and I think the important part in all of that, it had to be manageable, it had to be effective, and we recognised we had to give our volunteers a sense of achievement as well, because at the end of the day they're helping us recover from lockdown. Volunteer safety obviously is our priority, and I think the important message in all of that, and it's something I share with all of you, is we'll do this in our own time. So we're not going to be rushed, we're not going to be pushed into anything. We will bring our volunteers back in a way that we think is appropriate. So volunteers are the first ones, and wardens were the first ones, and then we started looking at what else we could actually do. Next slide, please. So what we've done, well, we've used national communications to keep our volunteers informed. As I said before, a lot of our local staff are on furlough, so our national volunteer team acts as a central point of contact. We made sure our volunteers knew what was going on. We made it clear why some roles are starting again and some are not. We put in place a clear risk assessment and had a safe way of working. And I think that was very, very important. That went out to all of our volunteers as they were gradually phased back in. And if you come into the chat room afterwards, I'll happily share that with you. You can have a look at what we've been doing. I think a very important part is something our national volunteer team did, which was clear task outlines. So as we brought volunteers back in, whether it was wardens or more, we basically made sure it was very clear what they would and wouldn't be doing. And I think it's very clear they do understand that it's not business as usual. Next slide, please. I think it's important, sort of bit of food for thought, really. If you change a volunteer's role, it's really important you don't become so focused on COVID that you miss other risks. One of the things we actually looked at is we had to make sure that for example, if somebody hasn't previously worked as a warden, they're coming back into a different role, they previously worked as part of a group, we had to consider that lone working might be something they weren't familiar with. So we had to make sure that they had a buddy system in place to make sure somebody knew where they were going and all this sort of stuff. So COVID-19 is a very big risk, but I think it's important in all of this that we don't lose sight of the other dangers that volunteers face. Next slide, please. I think safety basics. Some of you will have probably seen there is a VSG COVID-19 recovery planning document that has been circulated. We've done webinars on it before. In the Woodland Trust, we basically focus on personal hygiene and making sure that people have facilities on site for cleaning their hands and washing up, hand sanitizing gel, that sort of stuff. We make sure that social distancing for the size of the group and the work selection is available. One of the things we've also done is we've avoided riskier activities. So, you know, in any given year, even though we have very safe working and very safe volunteers, accidents still happen if you're using tools. People get cuts that need stitches and sprained ankles from tripping over in the woods. So we've basically reintroduced our volunteers to safer work. So what's happening at the moment is after volunteer wardens, we've created what we call relief wardens. So some of the members of our traditional working groups, which aren't going to be starting back anytime soon, we've repurposed them. So they're working in either alone or in pairs, going out into the woods, reporting problems, doing light maintenance work, fixing things that are broken, cutting back vegetation with small hand tools and that kind of thing. But we're limiting the scope of that work so that we reduce the likelihood of someone getting a cut that needs stitches or, like I said, spraining an ankle or whatever else. And most importantly, make sure volunteers have a clear, safe way of working and the critical information they need. So one of the things we give out to all of our volunteers is a map of the site. And on that map, it has the grid references of each gateway marked. So if they need to summon, you know, help or the police or an ambulance or whatever, then they can actually do that sort of quickly and easily. So that's kind of the process we've gone through. It's a continuing journey. Like I said, we brought volunteer wardens back first with clear risk assessments and safe ways of working. We've also brought back some of our individual working specialist volunteers. So we brought back what we call observatory volunteers, who are specialists that go out looking at plant health and tree disease. We've brought them back because they can help us with things like oak processionary moth and the risks of ash dieback, and they can do little surveys for us. And like I said, the relief warden programme, we've repurposed and retasked our traditional working group volunteers because they can't work in groups, and they've come back in working in ones and twos and going out and again helping us get our estate back on our feet. I think it's probably going to be at least September before we can actually look at a large working group volunteers doing traditional work, but we are reviewing it constantly. I work with the national volunteering team on a regular basis. Next slide, please. I think that's getting towards the end. Yeah, so that's basically where we are. That's our volunteer sort of journey. And if you're in the chat room afterwards, like I said, I'm more than happy to share our documents and our processes and procedures, and you can have a look at those. So thank you for listening.
That's great, Nick. Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll look forward to the members meeting afterwards and picking up on some of that information. I think the the whole approach of giving those volunteers a continued sense of achievement and what role they're taking in all this has definitely triggered some interesting questions there in the message pane. So I'm sure you'll be able to jump on there now and answer a few of those. I see Helen has been furiously answering away at some questions as well. If we don't get all those answered, folks, by the end of the session, don't worry, we'll try and catch up with those and get those through to you in due course. But great to see so many questions coming in. Encourage you to keep asking those, and the speakers would just hover over the wee question mark on their instructions there and jump on and help answer some questions would be brilliant. Sorry, we work our presenters hard on these webinars. You never get a moment's rest. So I'm going to pass over now to Joe Parry, who's the Volunteering Innovation Manager from the National Trust. Joe's going to talk about how they're welcoming volunteers back in visitor-facing tasks. So Joe, are you there?
Hi, Chris. Yes, I'm here.
Great. Well, we're all ready to go. Your first slide's up on the screen. Do you want to turn your camera on there?
Oh, yep. I think I have.
We'll get you up on screen too.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. Fire on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. I just wanted to touch briefly on something, Nick, that you said around safety being priority, and I think that's as a kind of start of a 10, definitely the summary of the approach that we've been taking. So. Lovely to be here today. My name is Joe Parry. I work as a Volunteering Innovation Manager for the National Trust. So that means I sit in a central volunteering team. So part of my role is understanding the internal and external changing landscape, and I suppose the impact that has then on those people that support us, whether it's a love for the cause or the place that they volunteer or the organisation. And I think we can all acknowledge that since COVID-19, those internal and external, the landscape has completely flipped on its head. So what I'll talk to you about is initially we looked at a national closing of all our properties, and now we're moving to a small reopening. And so that's worked through car parks, coast, countryside, parks and woodlands, and we are as a kind of aside piloting what it potentially could look like in built properties in a very, very small pilot and small amount of places. So hopefully I will be completely honest from the beginning, which I think has been the same with everyone. We've all been learning. I think sessions like this are so valuable to share processes, learning, challenges, because we've all been interpreting what the government guidance means for us. So next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Okay, your slides up there, Joe. Maybe just a wee delay, is it, or maybe a wee issue in your end there? Are you getting it okay there now, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think a little bit of a delay.
Yeah.
Yes, next slide, please. Oh, okay. I'll keep chatting through. I'm not quite sure. The slides haven't come at my end, but I'll give you a little bit of a chat through. So it's firstly worth thinking about putting a little bit of context around where the National Trust is at the moment, because actually that's been really important in informing our decisions moving forward. So actually what we are talking about at the moment, we have a list of priorities that organise the decisions that we make around COVID-19, and people, our staff and our volunteers are number one on that list. So every decision that we make is about what is best for people. So what we are in at the moment is mitigation stage. So can I see if we can get to the next slide? I'm not sure if you're seeing it your end. I can just see my introduction slide this end.
We're on your third slide at the moment, Joe.
Okay.
So we've got planning, response, mitigation, recovery, and returning to
no problem. Okay, so so I think at the moment the way to kind of put it is the National Trust are working through 3 R programs, and this helps us to think about this for volunteering. So the first one is around renewal, and what we mean by that is we're halfway through our organisational strategy, and what we need to think about is the impact of COVID-19 for the next 5 years. And part of that is then the next our reset program, which is what you might have heard about, the exploring how we might need to reduce costs to deliver that renewal program. And then thirdly, reopening, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit more around today. So next slide, please. So we have what we call our core volunteering principles. So these shape our decision making for anything volunteering related. So they're always the first thing that we talk about when thinking about bringing volunteers back. So with over 4,000 people involved in involving volunteers across the organisation, these principles help us to individually and collectively feel confident and have a consistent approach in legal and ethical and kind of practical decisions, which have been really, really important. This was pre-COVID activity, but has actually been even more important in this more recent exploration of when and how we can involve volunteers. So next slide, please. So it's important maybe set a bit of context to how the National Trust is structured. So I mentioned that I'm in the central volunteering team. We also have regional experts, so we call them consultants, just they're internal, but they're called consultants. And then our operational team, so the people that are doing the doing, and mainly though that they're the people today we're talking about that are managing volunteers. And it's the operational teams that make those decisions around when it's appropriate to bring volunteers back. So if you've got the principles, that is consistent across the organisation, but how and when and what activities people do, that's based on local properties. So up until a couple of weeks ago, about 80% of staff were furloughed. So I think that's a really important factor in all of this. And of course, most volunteering activity was paused. Throughout volunteers have been involved if they can be involved from home. So that's included things like we have some volunteers that support us with our data and with communications, and they played a brilliant role. Some people that are in specialist roles. So we define that as someone who is involved in an activity, and there are very few people do that activity, and it might be for circumstances in lockdown, only that volunteer can do that activity. Beekeeping is an example of that on one particular property. So, but as we start to then think about bringing volunteers back, one of the key elements to think about is what we define as essential tasks. So to bring our volunteers and our whole people, really, staff and volunteers back from furlough or from their pausing in their volunteering, they're brought back to do only what we define as essential tasks. So that tends to be when properties were closing initially. It's what's the functional and safe and almost kind of minimum activity that people need to look after that space, that place, while it is closed to visitors and while we were on lockdown. And now we are developing a new list, which is around reopening. So initially it was pre-opening and then reopening. What activities need to be done so that we can prepare for visitors returning to our places. So that's the first decision that we look at is something an essential task. And initially volunteers were brought back in non-visitor facing roles. And this was mainly just to make sure that teams could find their feet, test if there was different models, social distancing approaches, to then once someone was once the team was comfortable and had maybe tested it in a live environment, should we say, had given it tested it for a bit, then they could bring volunteers back. And quite interestingly, sometimes those roles that were non-visitor facing slowly evolved into visitor facing. So for example, in the Peak District, we had some people involved in litter picking, and over time, as lockdown reduced and more visitors returned, then it wasn't about those activities changing. It was just risk assessing again to make sure that the activities were appropriate and guidance was in place to make sure that they were safe. Okay, next slide, please. So people are our priority. We absolutely said this from the beginning. and what Nick was saying with safety being priority, so important. And with the regional decisions, what we tried to explore was what were our bottom lines. So what were our non-negotiables to be able to have that, to support our people and to ensure we deliver that duty of care. So first of all, volunteers were only brought back if we could adhere to government and our own guidelines, and of course social distancing was a really big part of that. Job substitution is actually a discussion that we've had a lot. So we're obviously with such a high level of people on furlough, wanting to make sure that volunteers and staff are brought back when it's appropriate and to the roles that are appropriate, protecting people's jobs and roles. So actually with a lot of, and I'm sure a lot of organisations are the same, blended teams where we've got staff and volunteers, we've had a lot of conversations to reassure and support operational staff to bring back volunteers again for only with essential tasks. But we looked at if they were able to, if they could be brought back, if they were being asked, if a volunteer was being asked to bring back if a volunteer was coming back to do an activity that they weren't actually doing beforehand, then that wouldn't be appropriate. So if a volunteer was bringing back to mow the grass, let's say, and actually that was a staff role beforehand, then that would not be appropriate to bring volunteers back to do that. And we've been working with unions and continually collaborating to make sure that we're working through those good conversations. Also, I suppose the last few points around shielding, Helen and Nick mentioned about supporting those people who are vulnerable to return, and a lot of discussion had been around making sure that we have individual conversations to make sure people are supported, are now about individual conversations to make sure people are happy and are ready to come back. But at the moment we're still not support prioritising health, so those that are shielding for now until those restrictions lift to not return to volunteering. We're also looking at not bringing volunteers back that are involved in external groups. It was interesting, Helen, to see a similar kind of approach. We are reviewing that, but not right now. And anything that is visitor facing is around outdoor volunteering. I'm just apologising. I can't quite see my slide, so I'm going with it. Next slide. You're doing wonderfully, Joe. Okay. You wouldn't. Don't say anything. You wouldn't know. You couldn't see your slides. You're doing really well. Okay. So so if we're thinking about visitor-facing roles and bringing people back, if we look at the two familiar with the slides, green boxes in front of us, some of the first conversations we were encouraging leaders to be having were around is it the right time to bring volunteers back? So for that many people on furlough, there was a lot of those people that were managing volunteers actually probably weren't those people who were usually managing volunteers. So did we have the capacity and support to bring volunteers back right now? Did we have the budget for ensuring that all volunteers would be safe and protected in the same way that staff would be? And was it a win-win? Pippa right at the beginning said about people being that kind of mutual benefit around the organisation, the volunteer, and the cause as well. So I think that's absolutely essential. And then once moving towards the volunteer manager and their activities, whether it's through conversations or through local or national training and support that we've been running, making sure that they can be, that the task can be articulated, that the task is so the individual can understand what they'll be doing and when they'll be doing and how they'll be doing it, and that they want to come back. Actually, we have a whole spectrum of experiences of people wanting and then not feeling so comfortable to come back, and it's understanding and respecting that from that individual person-centered experience. And then we've run so for every staff and volunteer coming back, we've run some e-learning called Reopening Safely, and the last few bullet points on the volunteer manager slide that's what that covers. So it's about our new service standards for reopening. It's also about individual processes to be safe, And then also what we thought was very important was arming our volunteers with how to potentially deal with difficult situations, which might include visitors who didn't necessarily agree with the processes that we were kind of putting forward to make sure that people were safe. Okay, and then final slide, or next slide. So if we think about what we found has worked, I know definitely understanding that although we are starting to bring volunteers back, and of course there's been a lot of external attraction around that in the press, that actually if we look at how many volunteers are coming back, it's actually only just under 4% at the moment. As everyone else was talking about, there's a very slow, appropriate timescale to bring volunteers back. So, and the properties on average at the moment are bringing 12 people back. So I think it's about really communicating that, because actually not all volunteers are being asked to come back right now, and there are reasons for that. So keeping the conversation open, keeping good dialogue with volunteers, where possible involving volunteers in planning and new processes and getting real good feedback. I'm definitely from a nothing about me without me kind of approach. I think that's a really good approach, and where you get feedback as to what's working and what's not, you know, making sure there's a you said we did or we didn't do and this is why, kind of really involving people. And then I suppose that the activities, acknowledging that some of the activities have changed, so managing those expectations with volunteers, but two ways. So for some people, the social element of coming on a Tuesday and seeing those volunteers that come on a Tuesday is what motivates someone. So just kind of managing the expectations that this is changing at the moment, and we're not quite sure what this is going to be looking like in the long term. And then final slide, which are just some personal reflections, I think, just to kind of bring it all together to finalise. I think to link back to what I said right at the beginning, actually we're all learning, and I think we're all finding our feet and we're all interpreting things in different ways. So sessions and days like today, where you get to just be really honest and be vulnerable and ask questions because other people are asking them as well. I think that's really important. And acknowledging that within teams, staff and volunteer teams, we've all been individually and collectively impacted by COVID-19, and to be kind and to listen to each other and what we might need on that person level at the moment. And then finally, that for a number of our places, and maybe nationally as well, it's been about thinking, not necessarily defaulting back to as was, really thinking through with volunteer involvement as well. Are the volunteer models working? And if they're not, what might we be thinking about to evolve them differently, I suppose. And that's everything from me. Thank you.
Joe, that was super impressive. I can assure you there are 120 people in makeshift offices all over the UK and Ireland giving you a round of applause now, because having to do a presentation with your slides jumping all over the place, I can assure you they flowed perfectly on our end. And
brilliant.
Had you not mentioned, we wouldn't have noticed at all. So really well done. Oh. And thanks for sharing those personal reflections at the end there as well. It actually it links me perfectly to the close in a sense that it's been really impressive to listen to all the presenters this morning, because they're presenting on a topic that, whilst it's their area of work, as you've all said, we're all learning. So to be asked to do a presentation in detail to 120 people is very admirable from you all. So thanks very much. I appreciate when doing presentations, it's not just the 10 minutes of talking at the time. It's the work that goes into those in advance and the thought that goes into those in advance. So and everybody is incredibly busy at the moment, dealing with whatever is coming next. So thank you, Joe, and thank you to all the presenters for your hard work. It's been great. As I've said to folk, you'll be an ORN easing will come out today, and that will come from inquiries at outdoorrecreation.org.uk. So make sure that's in your safe senders list, so it pops into your inbox and not your junk mail. And that'll hopefully go out later on today. That'll include video of this event, and it'll also include the transcript of the Q&A. I can see that Nick and Helen have both been furiously typing away to answers as fast as they can. They probably run out of time to answer them all. We'll hopefully pick up on some of those, certainly during the members meeting in a few minutes, and if not, we can pick up on some information ourselves after that. On a personal note, I want to thank Elizabeth and Jane from the Outdoor Recreation Northern Ireland team. Whilst I appear on screen at these things, I can assure you it's those two that do all the work behind the scenes and making this work. And also to Alan from Support IT NI. Alan's almost become a member of the ORNI team at this stage with all these webinars, so making sure that the tech flows perfectly for us. And we nearly got there, Alan, on this one without any technical glitches, but I think we worked out okay in the end. So that's it for this one, folks. Thanks very much. It was great. 120 if you stayed online all the way through, so that was great. And say we'll get that follow-up information, slides, videos, Q&A transcript out to you as soon as we can. We'll also be including a link to a survey as well. So whether ORN member or not ORN member, we'd love to hear from you. We're planning future events, we're planning future webinars, we're planning future activities for the network. So we'd love to get your ideas of what would work for you and work for your organisation. We want to make sure we're being visitor focused, we're being stakeholder focused in what we're delivering. So be delighted if you could take literally 5 minutes to fill in a quick survey monkey for us there. So folks, that's everything from now. Thanks again to the presenters. We'll give you a few minutes now just to jump on. You'll have to close this webinar down and then jump on to the VIP breakout room then, which will be like a traditional Teams meeting. So you'll appear on screen during that as well as us. So thanks again, and hopefully to see you all soon at the next ORN webinar.